What is up, everybody? This is the motherfucking Brad Hathcock here to bring you another Bradcast. That's right, we're gonna try and keep this thing going. It's been a while since I've done a Bradcast. Please check out our latest episode of the Eleemosynary Moment. That was just uploaded, I believe, yesterday or the day before, so go ahead and check that out. As usual, I'm going to start with something on the science perspective. As we all know, I kind of delve into a little bit of things science related. Always been one of my favorite subjects, and I find the things that we can do from a scientific perspective to be pretty excellent. So just a little bit of a preview there. Not only that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the Trump indictments, things along those lines, some new Republican power rankings that were released for the Republican Party, which seems pretty stupid. Let's see, we're going to talk a little bit about RFK, just from a perspective as he was just recently on Tucker's Twitter. And it was like about an hour and 20 minutes long or so, and they actually did not talk about vaccines. So it was a pretty good interview. So interesting to see there. We're going to talk a little bit about the Maui wildfires. Now, if you listen to the Eleemosynary Moment, you will see that there's a little bit of overlap there, but given the time differences between that podcast and this one, it's just a little bit more information that I have that maybe I did not have at that time. And then I have a special new segment that I'm going to try out here, and hopefully people like it and I can get some good feedback. As always, I'm drinking a beer or some form of alcohol as usual. But I digress. I like to have a few beers or so while I'm trying to do these things. So the first thing I'm going to touch on is something I find super duper interesting. Now, I saw this article a few weeks ago, but again, I have not done a Bradcast in a little bit. So, I had some time to kind of like think about this and see what's going on with this scientific finding that they have here. So super interesting and kind of opens up some questions ethically, legally, etc. Is that researchers in the United States and the UK have developed the world's first synthetic embryos built from stem cells. Kind of neat. Everybody's always kind of looking towards like in vitro fertilization and other ways to have babies. And older, more and more older people are trying to have babies and stuff as well. And we keep kind of extending the life of, or the fertility rates of women, things of that nature. So this goes into a very interesting space, right? Like, what can we do with these embryos? Like, what's really kind of the point of them? One of the things that these embryos do not need is eggs or sperm. So they supposedly would be able to grow a human basically just from these synthetic embryos. Again, they were made from stem cells. As we know, stem cells can do so many different things. People get injected with stem cells and stuff all the time to maybe heal injuries, recover from strokes, other would-be fatal incapacities and things like that. So I find this to be super interesting. The scientific aspect of it is great. It's vast. There's a lot of different things they could probably do with this kind of thing, and it's just interesting to note that that's kind of a big breakthrough. Scientists are basically saying that it could one day help advance the understanding of different genetic diseases and possibly even dial in the causes of miscarriages. So that's a very interesting piece to it, right? And that's on like the positive ethical side of things. it is important to note for the Republican perspective, I guess you would, or the pro-life perspective, that these embryos are at such an early stage of development that they do not have a beating heart or a brain. So obviously, one of the ethical questions here is, are these synthetic embryos people? I think that's a very interesting conundrum to kind of tackle from that perspective, right? Like, is what you just created a person or not? And I think that that is a little bit of a moral or ethical belief. Um, do I believe that one of these embryos is a person? I don't. Um, but that's just my perspective. I'm sure that other people have other perspectives. One of the things that I find super interesting about this is that there's no real clear regulations of governing stem cell models of human embryos. So I have talked, I think, before on my podcasts. For me, it's hard to remember what I do and don't talk about. But one of the things is the CRISPR issues that they've had. So there was a Chinese scientist who had been reprimanded and I believe ended up in prison for genetically altering children using CRISPR technology. So CRISPR technology is this. I honestly don't even know. I guess it's some kind of machine or something of that nature. I'm not entirely certain what it is in its physical manifestation, but CRISPR technology can be used to alter human genome ultimately, and basically you could theoretically engineer cancer out of, or the ability to have cancer out of human beings. You could genetically alter them to be resistant to AIDS or any other kind of fashion. Um, and is that ethically possible? For people to wrap their heads around, I'm not sure. I think the concern is that you would have an entire class of like superhuman who is just impervious to all sorts of diseases, and people who would have the money to pay for those kinds of things, right? So you already have like a class system here, and you have like your wealthy elites and just like your middle class, your uh, low class, I guess we want to call them, I guess, or the poor class, people who don't have the money for something like this. I don't even think the middle class would have money for, basically genetically altering themselves, but who knows? So that's obviously a big ethical question. I mean, what could they do to these embryos? Could they genetically alter them before they even need the CRISPR kind of technology? And given that there's no regulation about this kind of thing, is what they're doing ethically plausible? I don't know. It's not for me to say, obviously. I personally think it's fine. I find it to be very interesting, and I think the further that we can genetically alter ourselves or move in that kind of direction is important. It's the same reason why we're trying to fucking like leave the earth and move into space, and we're trying to explore different planets and find life on other planets. Maybe we don't need to find life on other planets. Maybe we build our own new life forms here. Uploading streams of consciousness to robots, and who knows, maybe we become a whole world of transcendent fucking robots. I don't know. It's a possibility. Everything's a possibility. Probably not in my lifetime, but as we see, science tends to get better and better and better every, say, 5 to 10 years. That's why I find it so interesting. Is science is such a vast system that encompasses so many different things. So things are always changing. They're always finding new things, new species. I know people are always concerned about species going extinct. And sure, but they're always finding new species of things as well. So it's just a little bit different. That's enough about that one. Let us know at the moment at gmail.com, maybe what your thoughts are on that one, and we can bring that one back up. But I find that one to be super interesting. The next thing I want to talk about here is the Trump indictments. So, Trump has just recently been indicted in Georgia for basically trying to go with the whole stop the steal thing. The indictment, quite honestly, seemed a little bit flimsy. But they all have, I guess, seemed a little bit flimsy. But this brings his indictment count up to, I believe, four. Um, as we know, he's still running for president, and that's to be expected, especially because he basically needs to win the presidency to pardon himself, to make sure he stays out of fucking prison. So he's going to keep running, and quite frankly, the idiots are going to vote for him. I'm not saying that everyone that is a Trump supporter is an idiot, but it's kind of amazing that they will listen to anything he fucking says. He started off with lock her up, and I'm gonna get Hillary Clinton in prison, and we're gonna take them all down, and all this other shit. And that never even came close to happening. That was all complete Trump bullshit. And now he's saying the same thing about Joe Biden. He calls him Crooked Joe Biden. And, obviously I believe that 100% that's true. Joe Biden is now being investigated. Documents are coming out that he used a pseudonym, especially while he was vice president, and obviously it's dealing with the whole Ukraine thing and Hunter Biden, and we've talked about that ad nauseum on the podcast, so we don't need to delve too far into it here. But the point is that Trump says that he will lock up Joe Biden if he becomes president. That's going to be his fucking war cry, his rally for everybody to kind of get around him. And it's stupid because that's not true. It's not going to happen. He will not lock up Biden. We're already seeing that one of the prosecutors, I believe, that was just announced as a special counsel to Hunter Biden was one of Trump appointments. And the Republicans don't want that now. They think it's a bad thing. So they can't even get behind their own fucking people that they appointed. So do I think that Trump was going to lock Biden up? Absolutely not. And quite frankly, the only thing that Trump might do is to maybe stop funding Ukraine, which I'm behind for the most part. You know, if you've listened to the podcast, again, we've probably talked about it ad nauseum, but I am not a big supporter, and this goes for really any country. I don't really believe that we should even have NATO, to be honest. Countries should be responsible for protecting themselves. If you want to be allies, fine. But unless we are directly attacked, I don't believe that we should have any recourse. And in this case, we have not been. But it is interesting to note that Republicans have released a set of power rankings for all of the candidates. And it's totally fucking stupid. It's just a ploy. I don't know. They're kind of trying to move past Donald Trump, but he shows up at the power rankings as number one, obviously, because people are still supporting him. And that's their right too. If they want to support Donald Trump, but it's not like Donald Trump isn't a criminal. Okay. Do I believe that some of these indictments are bullshit? Yes and no. I believe they are bullshit because they are definitely weaponizing the Department of Justice against him to try and basically make sure that he's not the nominee. But I also think it's because the Democrats want to move on from Joe Biden. And if they have Donald Trump win, then they have to run Joe Biden again because, quite frankly, he's the only one that beat him so far, and they need that. They have to keep beating him. One thing it's important to note, especially through these power rankings, is that the Republicans are just trying their hardest not to deal with Vivek Ramaswamy. He's a 37-year-old Indian fella who is climbing in the polls. Quite frankly, he's saying some of the right things. Do I agree with everything that he says? Absolutely not. But he's smart. Definitely a smart guy. He's got a lot to say, and I think he's got a good amount of things to offer people. Um, and it's kind of a fresh look, especially for the Republican Party, considering he is an Indian man. So he is does have brown skin, and you just don't see that a lot in the Republican Party. I know Tim Scott has actually been kind of coming on a little bit stronger in the polls, which is very interesting, considering he kind of seemed like a throwaway. Um, but the polls don't look great for like Ron DeSantis, who everybody thinks is like the front runner outside of Trump. So if Trump's not it, then DeSantis is. But I don't. I think DeSantis has really kind of like lost his star here, and he's not really being received as well, especially in Iowa recently. I think it was that he basically nobody gave a shit about him, which not good, obviously. But when you're going up against Trump, it makes things even harder if people aren't really giving a shit about you. And, Vivek Ramaswamy has really been stepping up and polling well. And he's on his way, which is, I think good for the Republican Party as a whole. Again, he's kind of an outsider. I don't believe he's ever held office, so it's kind of an interesting piece. But that's pretty much it for Trump indictments and the Republican Party. Like, I fucking hate Republicans for the most part. I mean, I hate Democrats just as much, with the exception of this next person I'm going to talk about, and it is RFK Jr. This guy surprises me on so many levels on what he talks about. He was just recently on Tucker's new show on X, formerly Twitter, and people have been talking shit on Tucker's new show and everything else, but it was a very interesting interview. It was one of the interviews that pretty much one of the only interviews given to RFK that did not reference his stance on vaccines, which is good. So I definitely encourage everybody to go watch what he says. And it's very interesting because he pretty much holds the belief that the CIA killed his uncle, which we all know to be true. And one of the things that was talked about on that show was the fact that RFK has not been given Secret Service protection. And there are some standards around Secret Service protection, such as polling at certain percentage of number, which I believe he said he has been polling like that for a while now, so he deserves Secret Service protection. There are, I believe, other people, Obama, one of them, I don't even believe was polling at the required status before he was given Secret Service protection. And so they kind of give it to everybody, but it's also up to the president to determine whether or not to hand out those protections. And basically, his request went completely ignored until the absolute last minute, where they just flat out denied Secret Service protection for RFK. And I find it to be very interesting because they clearly think that he's a threat. He is polling fairly well. He doesn't always come off as the best with his stance on vaccines, but that's obviously a very political issue. I stand behind RFK on a lot of things, but he does lose me in certain instances. He loses me on his stance for 2A. Like, he has stated in the past that he will support an assault ban, like an assault weapons ban, and I'm 100% against that. And I'm not a single issue voter, but that's a big one for me. So, like, I wouldn't vote for you because his stance is such as a banning assault weapons. And I just don't agree with that. Like for me, I'm sure there's other stances of his that I disagree with to a certain extent, but that's a big one for me. That's a core issue. So while I'm not a single issue voter, I will discredit you for a single issue. Now, am I going to agree with every single issue that a presidential candidate has? Absolutely not. I understand that once you get into office, things tend to be a little bit different as well because you can't really deliver on all of you can't really like deliver on all of the things that you promised, right? Because when you get there, you find out that everything works differently when you get into office. So it's definitely a bit different. But I definitely want everybody to check out Tucker's show with RFK. Like I said, he says a lot of very interesting things, and he really calls out, the media and the government for things that they're doing. That fly in the face of and kind of just spit in the face of the citizenry here. So please check that out. It's my recommendation for sure. You don't have to follow it. Who the fuck am I? I don't know. But if you're listening to this podcast, you might find it interesting. So moving on here, if you go back and listen to the Eleemosynary moment, especially the most recent episode, we talked about the wildfires, in Maui, and I find this to be completely interesting because a book came out about 2 days after the fire even started. The fire probably wasn't even completely out yet, and a book came out about these wildfires. A lot of people are wondering how that's even possible. My theory on this, I'm not going to read the book, I can tell you that, is simply that it's a climate change book. Because Democrats attribute virtually every single little event to climate change. And is that a possibility? Sure. But there's also things that could have been done to mitigate this disaster, right? And some of it was lack of government planning, similar to California. They would have controlled burns to kind of get rid of a lot of the brush and things like that tend to dry out and catch fire. Um, they had a lot of issues. Like, I think one of forget who exactly it was, but a local police officer, maybe like the sheriff or something, was supposed to like set off this alarm, and they just chose not to, simply because they figured it wouldn't help, which is fucking stupid. Like, it's flipping a switch. Like, all you had to do is flip a switch. Um, so that's part of it, right? I believe the fire started by like some electrical wires maybe going down, something along those lines. So there was a lot of issues here from the state government for sure, and it's definitely getting worse because of how the federal government is reacting. The title of our last Eleemosynary Moment podcast was "No Comment" because that's exactly what Joe Biden said while he was fucking sitting on a beach on vacation, and he just said "no comment" with a smile on his face. And now he's backtracking a little bit. He's saying that all of the assets will be given to you, and they're gonna give the residents of Hawaii $700 to help mitigate the issues that they have from the disaster. That ain't shit. You just sent like 200 billion more fucking dollars to Ukraine, and you're gonna turn around and give the residents $700? Like, how the fuck does that even help? Like, the average house, like the median house price in Maui is $1 million. Like, people like to say it's paradise, but if you look at big parts of Hawaii, like, they're really not that nice. A lot of people seem to be poor. It's another Democrat run fucking like area similar to California where it's mostly shitholes but still has high value prices, and it's because of the weather. Weather's nice. So, um you know, there's a lot going on here. I mean, people are saying that they haven't seen FEMA at all, and we obviously had our buddy Matt on who talked about everything with the hurricane that hit Sanibel Island in Florida and kind of just fucking ruined everything, and like FEMA is nowhere to be found, and this happens quite frequently. FEMA is just a really terrible federally run organization. It just, I understand the necessity for it. I understand its purpose, but just like pretty much every fucking thing else the federal government does, it's a travesty and it doesn't really work all that well. So that's, that's kind of where we're at with this. And there's a bunch of companies and things like that trying to come in and buy up the land of Lahaina. And, if I, quite frankly, if I'm one of those residents, sure, that's probably been my house for my entire life. But I'm telling them, okay, you want to buy my land? Sure. My house is gone. Everything I own is gone. My house was $1 million. I want 1.5 or I want $2 million. Set your fucking price high. Because they're going to turn around and build a golf course, or they're going to build a fucking mansion. They're going to build something, that is going to make it worth them paying that $2 million. You could take that $2 million and move to a real state like fucking Texas and live pretty well, off of that $2 million. You could definitely rebuild your life in some capacity. Whereas if you just stay, you're kind of fucking yourself over. Do I believe that they should be buying up people's land in an emergency? No, but the option's there. And if you want out, now's the time. Your shit just burned down. Pick your pick your life up and move. Like, we live in a different world today where you can work remotely, you can do different things. Like, why wouldn't you take that money and run? But you set your price. Like, set your price and set your price high. Like, work hard for it. And that would be good for you. There are people in Maui who own a fuckload of land. We have Oprah. We have the Obamas. We have Mark Zuckerberg. Because it's quote unquote paradise. So they own all these big houses, hundreds of acres of land, and they went untouched by the fires. Because they can pay somebody to fucking take care of it, right? They can pay to clear all the brush so that the fire can't spread. They were saying that the fire spread at 60 miles an hour. Well, I'm sure that somebody who works on one of their properties fucking called Oprah, called Obama, called Zuckerberg, and was like, Zuck, you gotta stop the jujitsu. Your house is gonna burn down. And he was like, fuck it is. And just threw $1 million at it. Because what's $1 million to a billionaire? Like nothing. So, you know, now might be the time to make your money and get the fuck out of there. Cut bait and go. Like, it is what it is, but this is really exposing some things. It's bad for Joe Biden, for sure. But quite frankly, natural disasters have been poor for pretty much every president that we've ever had. George Bush dealt with a lot of shit. I mean, he dealt with 9/11, obviously, with good or bad, who knows. But he also had Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina, he just had his little flyover. He didn't land. He didn't drop down and shoot the J with some paper towels and toilet paper like Donald Trump did in Puerto Rico after their hurricane. But he just flew over, and people look down on that. And this is one of them things where like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, because if you don't show up, everyone's going to tell you didn't do shit. That's what they're doing to Joe Biden right now. They're smashing him for not going to Maui. But it doesn't matter what you do. They shit on Donald Trump for showing up, and then they shit on you for not showing up. So there's virtually nothing you can do as president, um, to make a statement and then decide what you're gonna do. And Joe Biden says he's going to go, but he's not sure when. He says his reasoning is he doesn't want to get in the way of rebuilding efforts and all this other shit. Um, I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know what I would do. But I'm not the fucking president, so it doesn't really matter. Uh, Last thing I want to touch on is my new segment. This is a segment I have been promising, especially to my super fan, the one super fan that I have. He's always clamoring for a Bradcast. It's one of his favorite things, I guess. Mostly he just wants to laugh at me for being an asshole. So I am going to try out this new segment. Currently, I'm trying to look at my notes on it, but I have a stupid Chromebook, and God, is it terrible. It's enough for me to do some podcasts, but overall, it's dog shit. So just note, if you're going to get a new laptop, don't get yourself a Chromebook. Like, I can't even scroll on what I'm trying to do here, which is fucking terrible. So I'm going to try to get through this. So I'm going to do a segment, and it's called Will Your Government Kill You? Okay? So let me take everybody back to May 4th of 1970. And this is at Kent State University. One of the things about this segment to note is that I have plenty of things to talk about for sure. They are not going to be in any order as far as like a timeline goes. So just know that. So May 4th, 1970 at Kent State University. This was during the Vietnam War. And at this time, the Vietnam War was kind of waning just a little bit. Okay. Um, but there was still some protests going on, especially on college campuses. And this was no different. This was kind of just like a little bit of a standard, um, like a standard kind of protest. And um, so, students came out to protest, and but the war seemed to be waning. And then President, I believe then President Nixon, ordered troops into Cambodia on April 28th. So this is before everything actually happened. And people were pretty pissed about this. They felt like Vietnam was kind of coming to a close there, and then he ordered troops into Cambodia. Big mistake. So, on May 1st, two peaceful rallies were held at Kent State. But the night of May 1st, after those peaceful rallies were held, drunk people in town were, it's obviously college town, so there's going to be some riot, or there's going to be some drunk people. They were rioting, and it turns out that they were kind of burning buildings, right? Like, sounds a little bit familiar, kind of like the George Floyd riots and everything else. You know, it's we saw in 2020, especially when at the height of COVID, 2021, people burning cities and all this other shit, and it's really a bad thing. Like, that shouldn't happen, and I from that perspective, I disagree with what happened. We have the whole Kyle Rittenhouse situation, all that. But in this case, it was something similar. Okay. So what happens is these things start happening. There's a little bit of violence going on, and that goes on for maybe a couple of days. But on May 4th, the students showed up to protest, and it's tough, right? Because during these protests, things were, not things were mostly peaceful, as they said about protests in 2021 and everything else. They're mostly peaceful protests and what have you. Um, but all these students show up to protest, and it turns out that the National Guard opened up fire and killed four people. Now, it's important to note that the Kent mayor declared a civil emergency, thinking that violence would erupt. And it did, to an extent. Students had actually set the ROTC building on fire and burned it to the ground. Now, there were 1,200 National Guardsmen occupying the campus, and the governor had promised to use law enforcement against students. So you're already setting up a situation that is not good for anyone at all, on both sides for sure. But knowing what we know now, especially, they just kind of willy nilly let people fucking protest and burn shit down these days. So it looks like not much has really changed. But the fact that the National Guard opened up fire and killed four people is really unbelievable. And there's things here that matter. So not only did the governor promise to use law enforcement, but government officials agreed to meet with students, and they never showed up to that meeting. So you want to get shit done, it's called diplomacy, and they definitely should have used diplomacy here and tried to mitigate any potential disaster that was coming the way of Kent State University, for sure. Without a doubt in my mind, they definitely should have done that. And again, I'm sitting here trying to use a scroll bar that just isn't working. It's garbage, but ugh, God, this is horrendous. My apologies, everybody. Trying to get through this. All right, so that finally worked. So, how this was set up, because those people did not show up, the government officials did not show up for that meeting. The mayor, or the governor, my apologies, on May 4th, banned demonstrations. So essentially restricted your right to free speech. That's a constitutional violation for sure, because you have that right to peaceably assemble. I guess you could say they didn't peaceably assemble since they burned down an ROTC building, but I guess that doesn't matter in context. So they decided to fucking demonstrate anyway. Over 3,000 people showed up, only 500 of which were protesters. They had 1,000 people cheering on the protesters and another 1,500 people watching. Okay. So the National Guard was called in, and they sent 100 guardsmen to confront the protesters with M1 rifles. The guardsmen ordered the protesters to stand down, and they were met, the protesters themselves were met with bayonets. Well, that actually got a bunch of them to stand down. They started kind of moving and like moving back. But some people were chanting, some rocks were being thrown, but once the bayonets came out and everything, people started to leave. Which obviously, when you're just throwing rocks, would you rather get stabbed or Not stabbed. Most people are going with not stabbed. Um, so what happened was, while all of the people were retreating, they decided to open fire. There were 28 guardsmen who had retreated from the rocks and everything that were being fired. And the witnesses say that the 28 guardsmen who had retreated fired anywhere between 61 and 67 shots at the protesters. So now some of them were in the air, but some of them were at the protesters. 4 students were killed, and 9 others were injured. So the official response from the guard was that these troops said that they were shot at by a sniper. A fucking sniper on a college campus, at a pretty much random protest, right? So, like, who would have had the fucking time? Who would have known that the guard was coming in? All that shit, right? So, the setup is there by the government. There's no way. These people just didn't give a shit, so they opened fire, and then claimed later that they were under attack by snipers. We all know not true. It's never been proven to be true. Um, there's way more witnesses saying that that's not true than there are that say that there was a sniper. So, um, you know, we see the tragedy of 4 deaths of students, um, all that were within good standing of the university and everything. And it's just people don't care. You know, it's the government. They're going to do what they want. They're going to step on you. You know, Ohio, I believe, is a red state typically, and they quote unquote believe in freedom. I'd wonder how like JD Vance and other people actually react to this kind of shit. But ultimately, that's where we stood. Now, this actually sparked militant activism on other college campuses, and a second shooting occurred at Jackson State University in Mississippi on May 15th of 1970, where city and state police opened fire on student protesters, killing 2 and injuring 12 people. So one protest begets another protest. All of the people who, obviously had some issues with the Kent State shooting decided that they were also going to protest, and look where that got them. 2 more people were killed by the government, um, just for protesting. We all know that we have the right to peaceably assemble and to protest, but the government doesn't seem to think so. Um, at least each side, when the other side is protesting, decides that they don't need to do anything about it. But, you know, this is just one blip in many different instances where the government kind of just gets out of control and will kill you. And so the question being, as the title of obviously this segment is, will your government kill you? Yes. Yes, they will. You just have to give them a reason. And that's not that big of a reason, in my opinion, to just be protesting and experience that. So, will the government kill you? Absolutely. Thank you all for tuning in. I've been going on long enough about all of this shit. Please go ahead, like, and subscribe to the channel. And I will see everybody in the next one.